Welcome to episode 75 of the Positive Unpublishing podcast. This podcast aims to inspire you with information to allow you to pursue your creative life with a smile on your face. I'm your host, Catherine Guylet. Learn more about my work at makeeverythingfun.com. My guest today is Brooke Randolph. Brooke is the founder and director of counseling at the Greenhouse and a best-selling author of several books, and these are children's books. I'm so excited because, Brooke, I don't think I've had anyone on the show. Well, okay, I've had a few folks that have done children's books, but these are some special books that support what you're doing in your work with therapy and adoption. So I'm excited to talk to you about that, as well as all the other ways that you work with people. But just a little bit more about you, because you have an incredibly interesting background. You're a certified Imago Relationship Therapist, which is a therapy for couples that, gosh, I don't know how many people know about it, but it's very unique. It's very powerful, very transformational. You're also a certified Brainspotting therapist and consultant. Brooke was a founding member of MLJ Adoptions, Inc., and was a Young Professionals Advisory Board member for Indiana's largest nonprofit child and family services agency. Brooke's specialties include adoption, brainspotting, and relationships. Welcome to the show, Brooke.
Thank you, Catherine. It's great to be here.
And gosh, there's so many places we could get started, but I'd love to find out where your interest in working with adoption, working with relationships, working with couples, like at what point did you have maybe an aha moment that said, this is where I'm going to go into my life direction?
I think adoption has been on my heart maybe longer than would be able to pinpoint a specific time. I had experiences in undergrad where I walked with a friend while she made an adoption plan for her unplanned pregnancy, and they have a open adoption that continues many years later. Actually, I don't want to think about how old that child is now, because that means that's how long it's been since I've been in undergrad. And then started really shaping from day one of graduate school in my research and going to extra trainings even while I was in graduate school to really focus in on adoption. So that's just been my main priority throughout my entire career.
And I know that you've written some books that support. Now, this is actually the child's point of view, right, of adoption?
So no. Well, okay. Let me see. So there are two books that I have contributed to. Adoption Therapy was edited by Laura Dennis, and I was the only non-adoptee author in that book. And then I was the organizing editor for It's Not About You, which is a book about adoptee search, reunion, and open adoption. And it was really a case where just this book needed to be written. And I wanted to have the book to hand to birth parents who came in my door. And I wanted to have the book to hand to adoptive parents to come in my door, or really to hand to my adult adoptee clients to give to their adoptive parents as they were going through this process. And it's, I was like, it's not my book to write. It's not my book to write, right? I am an adoptive parent. How am I going to tell these people it's not about you? Until it was just one of those things that if it's ever going to get done, you need to do it. So I organized a group of authors who are from adoptees, birth parents, adoptive parents, and adoption therapists, so that adoption constellation, to put together this book. And so those books are written about the adoptee experience and helping to give more information, but not necessarily directed towards children.
I know. Now I'm like, okay, I was off track and she's getting me on track, because I think when the introduction was made to you from another Brainspotting consultant, I think it was written in the way that it was more a children's book, but I'm seeing it's actually an anthology, right? So you,
is that right? I did also write 3 children's workbooks, therapeutic workbooks. but those aren't like, those are just kind of extra things on the side that really, my editor kind of just said, no, you need to do this. And so I did it. So we do have those three. So it makes perfect sense that you would get those confused. They're just not adoption specific.
And it's so interesting how others view some of our accomplishments as being primary versus when we ourselves are talking about our accomplishments and what we think is primary. So again, like with this introduction, like the person that introduced us was like, whoa, she has these, they're workbooks for children. For some reason in her mind and her experience with you and your work, those were some primary things. And it's interesting to hear you talk, oh yeah, that's right, we did those, right? Not necessarily as primary. So anyway, I think that's an interesting sort of fun nugget for listeners. It's like, yes, there are always going to be different perspectives on our life's work. There is the perspective of the legacy that we are creating and what is primary there. And there's also the legacy of how others are viewing us. And I think that both of those perspectives are completely valid, and maybe even fun to compare.
Totally. Right? Like there's these 3 books that have my name on them as like the main author. And like, I'm like, yeah, like those are things we did, right? Because it's not my passion, right? And so even like, for me, it's more of a notable achievement that I just wrote a chapter in a book, right? But that I was asked to do that as the only non-adoptee author, for me says a lot.
Interesting. Okay. So that involvement in the anthology.
Yeah.
And so do you want to talk a little bit about the anthology and how that has shaped, whether that is how people find you? Because a lot of reasons to participate in an anthology is that it is this wonderful group experience, where it's not, a lot of times a book can be this solo journey. People talk about it as being the lone wolf, or they talk about like going into a cabin and writing, and it's the solitary thing. Whereas an anthology is it's way more collective, right? So tell us about, for those authors that might be listening, or aspiring authors, maybe some of the pros for being in this more collective experience.
Yeah. Well, and I have the experience both of being a contributor and then in the second book of being the organizing editor. And so they're very different experiences. And I think really organizing and editing an anthology may be more work than writing a full-size book.
No way. Oh, wow. Okay.
I could be wrong, right? I haven't written a full-size adult book, right? But one, you're organizing a lot of people and a lot of busy people because, of course, you want to have the best of the best working with you as much as possible. And so then you're supporting those people, and then editing both what they say, communicating with them, but then also, the layout of the book and what is our overall message, and do we need to, what all do we need to put in there? It was certainly a labor of love. I mean, it's not something that I would complain about at all, but I think that's an interesting thing for people to consider, because it sounds like, oh, I'm just going to organize other people and then I get to put my name on a book, right? I think for me, it was much more of, this was a thing that was needed and this was a gift to the community, right? And then there's the other side, right? Being a contributing author, where you don't have a lot of control or say, right? Like Laura started in on a second volume of Adoption Therapy, like Adoption Therapy 2, I'm assuming was the title. But that project got hung up several years ago, and I don't know where it is. Or what we contributed to that, if that will be published at some point or not. But I think those are really important things they build community for sure. And certainly people that I worked with on those projects, I then was able to work with on kind of speaking engagements, right, in presentations for conferences and other engagements like that. So you meet a lot of people, you have good value. Even in one case I know where I'm trying to remember the specifics of it. I believe something I wrote was taken out of context in an adoptee board, and that somebody jumped to my defense immediately and said, well, yeah, if it was any other adoptive parent, I would be right there with you, but I know her, right? And she doesn't, like, you're taking this out of context. That's not what she was saying. And it was really where, someone quoted one line from a blog instead of reading the entire paragraph, right? Which makes a huge difference.
So interesting. And I'm so glad that you're bringing up this whole anthology from these different perspectives. Because this interview is going to be right after. It's so interesting, because sometimes the timing of the actual interview and the release, obviously there's some lag time. And also in terms of when, the interviews take place and when, anyway, there's going to be right before this interview is published. This will be so interesting for me to go and listen to, and for the viewers and listeners to see this progression of a lot of contributing authors to an anthology that I was actually in. I was one of these contributing authors, and I'm actually going to have the coordinator on one of the interviews as well. So it's so interesting that you're talking about, because I think bringing light to the amount of work that the coordinator has is worth, it's worth shining some light on, because I think that when we write a chapter, say for an anthology, and I love that it's, like you said, it's from the coordinator side of the equation. It's about, like, this has to be shared, right? And this particular anthology that I was in was about, successful women in business that have been through, a lot of trauma, and it's basically this book about authenticity of, no, we're not all just so great and, successful and this, that, and the other, but instead it's about, this is what we've all been through, so that there's this idea almost of like a sisterhood of sharing the trials and tribulations, so that, because a lot of times you read a book and it's like a book, especially in business, and it's like, this person just did this thing right, and then they maybe made a little mistake, but they learned so quickly from it, and then they got all these practices, and then it was like, then they did that right. And you're reading it and you're like, oh my God, I feel terrible, right? Because I fall out of my face 100 times and I still haven't learned. So she kind of, this coordinator of this anthology kind of thought, hey, it might be nice for people to kind of have this theme of, like, trauma applies to most people. In fact, it applies to every human being. And people that have these successful stories, have been through a lot, and it's not always just like dancing through the tulips, right? So anyway, I think it's interesting that this is all then leading to, like, what your perspective is, and how rare to have a perspective of both contributing and then organizing an anthology. Did you have a favorite of the two ways, of the two paths?
Like I said, organizing is a lot more work, but it was, right, this project that I thought needed to be out in the world. And so, it is like birthing your progeny, right? Like, this is so important. I want to get this out here. And then I love creating things, and being able to share them with the world, educating people. So I think that the message was essential. The message was important. So that in and of itself is energizing. And it's not going to be that rare, because maybe you're going to now organize your own anthology. And so you can speak from both sides too. Anybody can do it, right?
Oh my gosh. I love how in these podcast interviews, that happens both sides. It's like, I might say something to somebody like, well, on your next book, and they'll be like, oh no. And then they write it, right? And then you just challenged me, right? Whether that was subconsciously or not, to do something like that. But that is a very, very interesting possibility. And so, Brooke, how did you figure out how to include the authors that you did?
Oh, that was a lot through networking. I'd have to remember what year it was that was published. But I'd been around the adoption world for at least a decade. So I had good contacts, right? And I was not afraid to reach out to people and say, we met this once, and I'm doing this thing that you need to do, right? And I really want your voice here. And are you willing? And sometimes it's, I don't have time for that right now. I'm doing these other projects. But just utilizing my network, the people I already knew, the people I'd built relationships with. For me, it's always been an essential part of adoption therapy that I built solid relationships with adoptees. I was telling one of my mentors last week that I was asked to help start this adoption agency, right, in about 2007, and really presented with, we need somebody with a social services degree or we can't have an agency. And so you can do that and you're going to be in charge of all of this stuff. And so they're basically throwing me into an executive position and a founder's position. And I've learned since then that this is not everyone's personality, but my personality was like, well, then I have to know everything. Like if I'm going to be the person, I have to know everything, and just spent all of my time reading and building relationships, getting stories from people who'd had that experience. And so that's where, I started the reading and the research, and moving past that was I have to know the people, right? If I'm going to advocate in an adoption agency for the children, if I'm going to prepare all of these prospective parents for what they need to know to raise these adopted children, then I need to understand what it was like from these children's perspective so that I can teach the adoptive parents, right? And so building those relationships, I had basically a personal policy that any adoptee who wanted to tell me their story, I would buy them a cup of coffee, I'd buy you breakfast, buy you lunch, so that if you would be willing to tell me your story. And then as we were an international agency, anyone who'd grown up in that country that we were working in. Because while I learned a lot being on the ground, when I would travel, like it's never the same as what it's like when you grow up in that situation. And so just gathering stories, listening to people, I built a lot of relationships. And then as an adoptive mother, those relationships were hugely important because I fiercely guard my son's story. And if there's ever a thing I need advice on, adoptees understand implicitly, right? Even without all the details. And they have compassion and they will protect his story too. So, of course, I have friends and advisors who know my son well, but those adoptees that I have good relationships with, I find those essential as an adoptive parent.
I love how you're talking about how it's almost like you've collected stories, or you've been a collector of stories, and almost like a story bank, right? But it's this bank of gold.
I like to say that I collect good people. And so I will, gather stories, listen to people, and I think I have a really wide network because it's important to me to collect good people.
I love that. Well, I can get a sense of the stories and the network and the connections, and then the books and the way that you've contributed to different books, and yes, the children's workbooks as well. But in your experience, in your bio, the Brainspotting comes out, and I'm curious. We're going to switch gears a little bit from the book writing into how you work with people. But how do you bring Brainspotting into this area of adoption and how you work with people?
Oh, well, I wasn't expecting that. I'm actually so as a consultant, right? I educate people and will answer questions about Brainspotting with adoption. I lead a Facebook group for clinicians, helping to share some more information, because one of my biggest soapboxes, that's my entire chapter in adoption therapy, is that there are not enough adoption competent therapists. And really, probably all therapists are working with adoption, whether they know it or not, because adoptees are overrepresented in many populations. But the therapists aren't educated in it. It's not something that is talked about in graduate school, even though it is so common. And people think they know, right? Because I have had this one experience, maybe with a client, or maybe with like my neighbor who was an adoptive parent, or my cousin. And so you have one or two experiences, right? Instead of this bank of stories. And so people feel confident but may not be doing the best work. So the clients that I work with are primarily adult adoptees who've had bad experiences in therapy, whether that was when they were a kid or as an adult, but some therapist said something dumb or something offensive. They may have really meant well, but they didn't do as well as they could have. So it's like my passion, right, to share good information with other therapists and to help them be the best that they can be, right? Really just promoting excellence in therapists. And so as I've done that, I have developed some Brainspotting setups, particular for adoption. And of course, like with Brainspotting, all things can be shared in different ways, but I have a few setups that I am looking forward to sharing with people through consultation and maybe eventually through training that are specific to adoption. And I'm just so excited about being able to do that and just sharing just all the things I've gathered over the years about adoption. I started to put it into a outline, and Dr. Robbie looked it over for me, and she was like, well, you've got like a 4 or 6 day training here. Like, well, that may be a little bit more than anybody wants. So, but just like looking at all the information that I have that I'd like to share, there's so much there.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So, I mean, I'm going to go back to what you said about people actually being traumatized by things that are spoken in the therapeutic setting. And I invite listeners and viewers to take a look at some of the episodes, and I will link to them in the show notes, about Brainspotting as a modality that is, focused on eye position, on mindfulness, on bilateral stimulation, and on attunement between the therapist and the client, but not as much focused on what is said. In fact, I love the acronym from Brainspotting, WAIT, which reminds the practitioner, why am I talking? Because there is the possibility to make incredible healing or processing, which is the way we talk about it in Brainspotting, in this containment or this frame that is created by Brainspotting with the fixed eye position and the bilateral and the attunement and all that. But the weight and like, why am I talking? What you were saying before about how it's not just that weight doesn't allow something to happen, meaning when you're talking, but it's also like that the talking itself can create a trauma or a re-traumatization. So because you said somebody said something stupid, right? So no blame and shame here to anyone.
Right.
But and sometimes these things that we say are actually things that are like voices in our head, right? That traumatize us. But can you give an example? Again, maybe it's even like a self-talk thing that can happen in your, in the setting that you work with, that can give people a sense of, oh my gosh, like maybe I might want to try something like that, or I'm a therapist listening and I might want to try something like what Brooke is teaching, because I have noticed that my clients can't talk their way out of something, that there might be some other way, a non-talking modality like Brainspotting, that can really allow clients to process and heal faster.
Oh, I mean, so many examples. So I can think about, think about an adult adoptee who is internationally adopted. And at this point, right, it's been 20, 25 years. Their brain primarily only thinks in English, but they have so many experiences in their first 5, 6, 10 years that are in another language that they may or may not have full understanding of. So we have to use a deep brain-based therapy to work through those experiences because they are coded in a different language. deeper in their brain that they can't actually speak well right now. Right. And even in going through the translation of it, we would be adding additional layers and overcomplicating the process. So if I think about this adult adoptee, that they may not remember some of the things, right, that happened when they were 2, 3, 4, even 5, because there are other traumas that then happened that you put those things behind, so that they need something like Brainspotting. It also brings up for me some young international adoptees that I've worked with, who are just now learning English. So clearly their memories aren't coded. They don't fully know English. They haven't fully forgotten this other language, and they are working in between the two. And I think about this one sibling set that I worked with, and I would work with all the kids one in a row, and we would work on like, my brother kicked me, or my other brother was so loud, or the van was dirty. I mean, like very childlike things. And then they would go home, and in the next 2 days, they would talk about their country of origin. Right? And so they got to do that work with their adoptive parents, which was probably even more healing, but because I helped them get deeper into their brain, right? It's so powerful, right? And even as we think about, right, those are 2 examples from international adoption, but if we think about a domestic adoption, we think about these infants who are biologically primed to attach to their birth mother, that they are born and then transferred, whether they're left alone, whether they're moved to foster care for just a few days, or whether they're, taken in the birthing room by the adoptive parents. There is still this like confusion because they've been biologically primed for certain smells and sounds and tastes, and they're not there. And so for an infant who has no other experiences, right, that is a trauma. There is no way that an adult or a 15-year-old or a 5-year-old can process that implicit memory, right, that's not coded in language, and that we need these kind of brain-based therapies to get into that experience for them.
It's so interesting because, I've seen Dr. Grand work with folks that have a second language. And I actually had that experience of, I was a baby and we were in South America and there was a lot going on. This was when Allende was overthrown by Pinochet, and so our family had to leave the country. And folks could also read anything by Dr. Gabor Mate, and he was, given away. He was cared for by a distant family member. And, I think when he was a very small infant. So there's some, he has studied how these early childhood traumas then translate into, body manifestations of dis-ease. It's extremely fascinating. But where was I going there? So I was going there with the idea that I saw David Grand actually encourage, through this attunement process, encourage the person he was working with to speak in their native language, even though I don't think that Dr. Grand understood everything she said. But just that ability for her to be able to go to that part of her brain that was a different part, that was a younger part, allowed her to process. And so it was so interesting. There was still this very, very tight attunement, even without necessarily a verbal understanding. It was more like an energetic and a nonverbal understanding between the two of them, as opposed to verbal. And it kind of just goes back to what you were saying before about, what's more important here? Is it the words or is it something else? So thank you for bringing awareness to this. And I know that you work, you've got an online couples program, and you work with therapists to bring more awareness around some of these issues, nonverbal therapy, brain-based therapies. Would you like to go first? Because since we were just kind of talking about therapists, we could kind of talk about your work with other therapists. And then I want to make sure that we save time to talk a little bit about how you work online with couples.
Sure, we can do that. So I do individual and group consultations for therapists who want to know more about brain spotting or about adoption to really expand their work in those areas primarily. I mean, obviously, I'm happy to work with other therapists who just want, maybe if they want to understand a little bit more about working with couples or spirituality. I was actually asked recently to do a consultation group about growing your business, right? And so some brain spotting therapists who would like some more information on just growing your business. And so we're putting together a small consultation group to do that and to help them work on what they need really to practice excellence in what they're doing business wise, right? And obviously working in the brain spotting piece of that. But I love working with therapists, being able to influence therapists so that I can then have an impact on their entire caseload, right? And in a consultation group, I could spend 2 hours working with 10 therapists, and that's 10 different caseloads that I got to influence in 2 hours. And that is amazing. I love that opportunity.
And I think that's why a lot of listeners and viewers are interested in the whole creative process, whether that is writing or creating art, whether it's poetry, memoir, children's books, workbooks. It is a way to make this world a better place, and obviously making it a better place through our one-on-one interactions and our one-on-one work is so important. But when you start to kind of get into that leverage idea, that's where creativity comes in, whether it's the consultation groups, working through groups, or working through creativity, how people react to what you're writing about, or what you might have created in an image, in a painting, or photography. Those are different ways that we can affect people on a more broad scale. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's important when we are called to reach more people that we don't just go, oh, no, I'm too busy doing what I'm doing. But instead to listen to that call.
Mm-hmm.
And so tell us, Brooke, when you felt that call, you have a graduate degree in counseling, and you've trained to work in this special, almost sacred space with people, right? Mm-hmm. But then also there's this call to bring your work to more people. How did that was this sort of like a whisper from the universe, and then it started to tap your shoulder and tap it a little bit harder, or was it a singular moment? Do you remember?
Probably not a singular moment, and probably something I resisted, right? So even as I started a group practice in Indianapolis, right? I bought this big building for my office and was just going to rent out those other offices because I didn't need to do any of that, right? And then the right person comes in my door and says, well, somebody told me you might be doing this. I was like, oh, I guess we'll do this, right? And probably things that I've just resisted in my caseload is really very full. So, I mean, yeah, I'll do the consultation training because I want to learn more about brain spotting, but didn't really necessarily foresee that until all of these different things, right? And then as we went into quarantine a few months ago, right? And I'm sort of homeschooling and working from home and figuring out that and recognizing what really fits best for my family. And that my son really likes being home. And we have extended family members who are immunocompromised, and we need to be able to take care of them. And so maybe we're going to stay home a little longer. And so if he's going to stay home a little longer, what do I need to be doing? And do I need to be, engaged with clients, or do I need a little bit more flexibility? And so I just keep going with whatever comes up, figuring it out as I go.
Well, and thank you so much for admitting to that resistance, because I think a lot of times people don't recognize that. I think what I would summarize your resistance as is maybe I don't have time, right? Mm-hmm. So we might hear these things like, I'm too busy, I'm already full, I already have a full caseload. I'm not set up that way. Like there's all these different variations on that resistance. And so then what I'm hearing is this sort of openness to being in the flow allows you to overcome that resistance. I think all of us need to be very aware of that because resistance can be very strong.
Yeah. And I think you're characterizing it correctly. And I may have thought of it as just like, oh, I don't need to do that. Or humility, like, I don't, like, why would I go and start a consultation group? Why would I go do that? If people really want to meet with me, they'll let me know. But sometimes
faces of resistance, right? Why me? You know?
Yeah.
I think there's a book about that, The Faces of Resistance. So if anyone wants to see more about what this looks like and how to overcome that, I think it starts with awareness. And then then of course it comes to how you individually can overcome those faces of resistance. But I love Brooke's, which is just being a little bit more open and going with the flow. So your work with couples, is this something that, it sounds like you've been doing it for a while, but it's taking on a different shape in this online format. So do you want to talk about that?
Well, I will say Imago Therapy works really well online, right? In some ways, I find that there were couples who it immediately worked better with because I was just that much more removed, right? And in couples therapy with Imago, we want them to talk to each other. And the therapist acts as a coach and a guide and helps them to deepen and create the space. But ultimately, we want them to be able to do it without us, right? I don't want to be the third wheel in relationships. That's not what I want. So I want them to be able to figure out what they need to figure out in their relationship and be able to do it on their own. So being able to do it in the telehealth setting allowed me to be just enough further back that they really were more focused on each other and not trying to use me as an arbitrator or explaining their positioning to me. So it really helped us just get into that Imago work even deeper. And I also have found that a lot of this information is really helpful in more of a classroom setting or in education. Right? People have the idea of therapy where you're going to go and talk to a therapist. And so if we're a couple, we're going to go and tell the therapist my side and your side, and they're going to tell us how we need to think. Right? And that's just not what Imago is all about. And so as I got to a place where, as a single mom, I'm not doing evening appointments, that I still had a lot of people calling and calling and calling. So I created a online course of 9 weeks teaching Imago theories. It's based on the Couplehood, A New Way to Love program, and giving them all the tools that they would need. And for some couples, they find that's all that they need. They learn the skills that they need. And for some people, I'm finding that it's such a great introduction to how to make couples counseling effective. And so while they were waiting to get on my schedule or they needed to have more flexibility to meet in the evenings, they could do those things at home and learn the skills that they needed and practice the skills and get the homework assignments from the comfort of their own home.
And so, Brooke, is this a self-guided course so that, or does it have times when you come in to do some facilitation, or tell us how the course works? And
so that course is completely self-guided. It is hosted on a Teachable website. Mm-hmm. And so the couple logs in when they want to log in, and they get one session per week where they're going to get a video with instruction and some additional resources and a homework assignment for them to then go practice. Right. And then the next week they'll get another one after they've had a week to practice or do their homework. And some people aren't going to do one every week. They're going to wait and they'll do one right in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks, because again, you have to make it work in your life. And You might have a sick kid on the day you thought you were going to sit down and do this course together. And so it just works well for everyone to do it in their own time and in their own space and what makes sense for them.
Well, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more, spend at least another few more minutes about this course, because I think that right now, we just mentioned that we've been in isolation, and so things are changing within our relationships. And so there are some couples that are needing to redefine, like one couple, might have had a person who was traveling all the time and now they're not, or they're in the same space and they've got their kids home and they don't normally have that. And so while some people have found that, that this whole isolation period related to COVID-19 or 2020 has been a great time to work on things, other people have found that it's been a triggering situation because of the additional pressures of having, you mentioned homeschooling, having kids home, people under the same roof, in more confined space. What's so beautiful about I'm assuming that not everybody knows a lot about Imago, so I'll do my little summary of it, and then you can give yours because you know a lot more about Imago Therapy. But Imago really is it's a relationship or couples relationship philosophy that really addresses the fact that we do have childhood wounds. Like, we can try to be in denial, but you know what? We are actually all trying to have our needs met, which are based on wounds. And, that we have, what I love about Imago is there's this dialogue. And I'm assuming that that's a lot of what the course is about, is how to create a dialogue that really, has this eye contact, that has this ability to mirror back, to reflect, to ask, is there more, to empathize, to get to that stage. I can't even remember what it is. It's something like mirroring, validating, or empathizing might be the stages of it. But anyway, did I get it right?
Yep, you did.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe that. So, but then having these abilities, the ability to have these dialogues, which frankly do not come naturally, right? I mean, the dialogue is not something that we are ever taught in any avenue of our life, are we? Unless we see an Imago therapist.
Right. And we're not taught, and it feels awkward when we start, but it works so well. And so it's getting people past that, this feels weird to say things this way, and into the experience of, oh, this works, right? When I use these skills with my child, that tantrum didn't last nearly as long. Oh, right? So when I do this with my partner, we don't end up in a huge blow up, that we can bring it back. And so recognizing the benefit of it helps people move past the awkward. Yeah.
And Brooke, I've done a lot of work with authors where we take a book and we bring it into a course. So the whole idea of a course actually fits really, really well into the context of this podcast. One thing, of course, it's great to be able to talk about with a course is that it takes you from, let's say, Pain Island to Pleasure Island. And some people don't like the pain point terminology, but it does kind of say, like, this is the issue that I'm dealing with right now, and then this is where I want to go. And then in between is the course that takes me from A to B. So can you summarize sort of, for somebody that might be in this Pain Island or point A, what does that look like? And then where does the course take them so they can kind of know, oh, I want to go on that journey?
Mm-hmm. I mean, Pain Island could be anything from just feeling disconnected, like the sparks aren't in this relationship anymore, we've quit having sex, or to like, we're fighting every day, or I'm not sure we're going to make it, right? And we've talked about divorce, and right, I see people on all of those levels who are coming in for couples counseling, right? But when there is a problem in your relationship, you want to fix it, right? I like to joke that people are going to drag their kids to therapy, please fix my kid. And then they're likely to drag their relationship to therapy, please fix my relationship. And then least likely right, is when people say will bring themselves into therapy to work at that, because we can bury our own pain. But it's really scary, the thought that we might lose a relationship, or that we've lost the connection that we once had. And so people experience that pain pretty intensely, and they are motivated to improve their relationship. And this gives them some really tangible skills to learn and tools, as well as the background information to recognize the childhood wounds that are coming up, right? The unmet needs or the unfulfilled dreams that are then, like I say, I like to give the example of, well, I'll just give the whole example. I don't always do it, and I don't know who your listeners are. But when I first got my dog, which people can see if they look up on Instagram, because he used to come to the office with me, I also got a tattoo on my leg. And so I had a really excitable puppy who just wanted to love me and who would jump up and hit that healing wound, right? And this is exactly what happens in our relationships, right? Oscar did not put that wound on my leg. He wanted to love me and jumped up and accidentally touched it, right? But if you have a wound that is healing and somebody touches it, it's hard not to react. And that is, like, to me, the most perfect example of what happens in relationships all of the time, right? Our partners are trying to love us, and they unintentionally bump up on old wounds and bruises, and we're reactive to the thing that happened before. But it's like, you touched that, and so we think it's about the relationship. And so then we try to have all these discussions that go nowhere, and everyone's still mad because it's never about the sock on the floor. It's never about what just happened here. There's always the history. And so this course also gives those tools that people need to kind of start looking at those things and finding out what those things are, because we don't always know what they are in ourselves. We don't know why we're reacting so strongly. And so being able to walk people through all of that while also building connection and really creating that huge foundation for their relationship so that they can get the love that they want.
That's so true about it's not about the sock on the floor or, the dishes in the sink or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's about something else. And that's such a beautiful summary of what Imago Therapy is about. So thank you for doing that. Thank you so much for creating that course. I know it's going to help so many people. Thank you for your work with therapists. Thank you for bringing in Brainspotting to the world of adoption and having that specialization. Is there any other area of your work that you wanted to mention in the few minutes that we have left? We're almost at the end of our time together, and I also want to give you an opportunity to give people, you mentioned Instagram, but websites or social media where people can find your work, learn more about you, follow you, and hopefully get involved with your work.
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I guess I'm on LinkedIn, but I don't really use that. Therapists are a little more, I don't know. Therapists don't seem to use LinkedIn nearly as much, but maybe that's just my growth area that I need to work on that. And then my website is brooke-randolph.com. My Teachable website is brooke-randolph.teachable.com. So always you can find me. My name is spelled BROOKE-RANDOLPH.
Awesome. You don't have one of those crazy to spell last names like I do, so but I will put your links in the show notes. I'm so excited about your course and about your work with therapists and what you're doing in the world of Brainspotting and Imago Therapy and adoption, and in creating a healing community through your creative work as an author and editor and collaborator as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to being in touch and being engaged with your work.
Thank you so much. It was so much fun.